goal here is to look at kind of the lasting contributions of the Greeks. Why is it that we're studying these individuals who lived thousands of years ago, walked around in togas and all that stuff? That's at least the perception. Now, one of the main contributions, or I would say one of the main contributions, is the word and idea of history. And history does come from the Greek, which means inquiry. Now, this is very appropriate since Herodotus is often referred to as the father of history. Now, Herodotus eventually made his home on the island of Samos, and he was an extensive traveler. His goal was to interview participants and witnesses to major events, record their stories and perceptions in an effort to figure out what truly happened. So he was all about, you could say, investigative journalism. Now, in Athens and other Greek city-states, he gave public readings of his accounts, and he became friends with the poet Socrates, who convinced him to transform his book into a history of the Persian Wars. That's why we associate Herodotus with the Persian Wars. Now, much of what we perceive to know about the Persian Wars comes from his writings, and they're not always accurate. We believe that he inflated the statistics, or at least the accounts he got inflated the statistics of the number of Persians at the Battle of Thermopylae. But he introduced the descriptive method of viewing history, where you attempt to use the experiences of others to comprehend events. Now, Thucydides is our other historian, and he participated in the Peloponnesian Wars and personally survived the plague of Athens. Very little is known about his life, but he was elected general in 424. But he was defeated in battle during the Peloponnesian Wars, and that led him to be exiled for 2 decades. During this time, he wrote his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, which is more explanatory than descriptive. So we do have history, Herodotus and Thucydides. Now, in the field of mathematics, Euclid is often referred to as the father of geometry, and he was active in Alexandria in the early 300s and late 200s BC. You're going to see that a lot of the contributions of the Greeks, it's kind of an even split. A lot of the philosophers are based out of Athens, but the others made their contributions in Greek-speaking areas. Now, many of Euclid's contributions were published in what was called Elements, and although many of the works had already been known, he was the first to take them and organize them into a simple, easy-to-understand framework. So we associate Euclid with geometry. Pythagoras is credited with the Pythagorean theorem that bears his name, although the equation, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, it was already well known to Babylonians and Indians centuries prior to this. Now, this means that Pythagoras most likely introduced the theorem to Greek culture. And interestingly enough, it was said that he promptly sacrificed an ox after discovering the theorem. And that kind of validates the strict respect for tradition and ritual that the Greeks had. Archimedes is an individual who simply contributed to science. And he was from the island of Syracuse and was absolutely brilliant. Among his many contributions, he's the one who discovered that the greater the density of an object, the greater the displacement would be. Now, he discovered this while in his bath, and he was so excited that he screamed, "Eureka!" or "I have found it!" And he ran naked through the streets, so he was pretty pumped about it. Much of his other contributions were in the name of war, because he lived during the Punic Wars and the rise of the Roman Republic. It's not as if the Greeks had their heyday, and then the Romans had their heyday. They existed simultaneously. Now, his Archimedes screw was designed for a naval warship, and his lever allowed sailors to lift items that would otherwise be too heavy. Now, the 2 accounts of his death, he was killed by the Romans, but the varying accounts of his death demonstrate the rising power of Rome. Now, Roman forces captured Syracuse after a 2-year siege during what was called the Second Punic War. That was the war where Hannibal rode war elephants across the Alps. Now, he was working on a mathematical diagram when he was told to go and meet the Roman general in charge of the siege. He refused because he needed to finish his problem and was killed. That's one account. Another story suggests that he was carrying mathematical objects and was killed by a Roman soldier who thought that he had valuable items. Either way, whichever story you believe, we do know that the Roman general in charge was irate because he wanted Archimedes taken alive due to his knowledge, and he could be used against Rome's enemy, Carthage. So the science of Archimedes survives to today. In the field of medicine, Hippocrates lived during the age of Pericles, so this is the Greek Golden Age. He's often called the father of medicine because he recognized medical science as a field that was distinct and unique from other fields like philosophy. Hippocrates was one of the first to ascertain, to figure out that diseases occurred naturally. They were a natural occurrence, and they're not attributed to superstition or the gods. He was so influential, and his thoughts were considered so sacred that no advancements were made for centuries that deviated from his methods or his findings. He was known for his professional manner and insisted that observations be documented in a clear way so they could be passed down to others. He also categorized illnesses. He categorized them into acute, chronic, endemic, and epidemic. The Hippocratic Oath, which may or may not have been his doing, the oath that all in the medical profession are sworn to, all doctors must take the oath that bears his name, still survives today. So these are some of the main contributions of the Greeks. We also have to acknowledge the thinkers, like Socrates. And you see one of his main quotes. Socrates was an Athenian, and this came to define his life. It's really hard to figure out what his life was really like and what his appearance was, but we know that he apparently was ugly in his later years. That's something that emerges. And he was brilliant. Socrates was known to wander the agora and question and debate. He refused to accept payment for his services, and his method of asking questions to seek deeper truths is known to us as the Socratic method. In 399 BC, Socrates was actually taken to court on charges that he insulted the gods to his students, and therefore was accused of corrupting the youth. He was given a choice of death via hemlock poisoning or exile. He chose death rather than leave his beloved Athens. It was widely assumed that he would choose exile, and the assembly wanted this because they would rather he be kept alive. But again, he couldn't bear to part with his beloved Athens. His two most famous students were Xenophon and Plato, the philosopher, and Plato never forgave the people of Athens for their choice. This is going to lead Plato to condemn the practice of democracy. And on that note, Plato traveled extensively after the death of Socrates, and then he returned to Athens to open up his own school of philosophy and mathematics, the Academy. Now, he banned the teaching of rhetoric, dialogues, argument. He banned it, so that made him different than his competitors. He ended up writing a series of 25 dialogues, all of which have survived. And his Republic is where he outlines the ideal state. An ideal state, according to Plato, is governed either by wise men or philosopher kings. So this reveals his disdain for democracy. King Philip of Macedon admired him greatly, and it was written that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. That's how influential Plato's thought was on Western thought. So first we go from Socrates, then to Plato, then to Aristotle. Now, Plato's most famous student was Aristotle, and Aristotle, in turn, was the son of the court physician to Macedon, so he had a Macedonian connection. He left the academy after the death of Plato, and was eventually summoned back to Macedon to instruct Alexander. Alexander is the son of Philip. He also returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum, which was in a grove that was sacred to Apollo. So this is his own school. He would lecture students in the morning, and in the evening he would give talks to the general public, as opposed to what was called the abstract speculation of Plato, the philosophizing. Aristotle preferred empirical evidence, observation. He sought to catalog and describe the biological world, including animals and human beings. His works, including observations of the known world, so he believed the sun, the moon, and the planets revolved around the earth, they remained influential through the Middle Ages. And finally, all of these men emphasized the importance that was placed on philosophy in culture. The spread of culture. This is something you often find. You have an empire. You build it up with your military. You spread your culture so that when the empire eventually goes away or weakens, the culture survives. So that's often the mark of a successful society. Now, after the end of the Golden Age, Greek became the language of the cities. Urban centers spoke Greek. And it also became the language of the educated and the language of the Near East. The spread of language is also the mark of a successful empire or civilization. It's very much like how Latin spread with the Romans and then spun off into Romance languages. Or even how the British Empire spread the English language, and it continues to be influential today. So all of these markers are things that we can take from our predecessors, the Greeks.